In Autopsies of Episode 9, fans have been prominent. Their desires, their expectations, and especially their service. Yes, much of the criticism has highlighted the fan service, which has led to a discussion of fan service as a concept. I've been thinking about it too, especially as it relates to, yes, Final Fantasy XIV. I had enough thoughts that it seemed like I should address them in my main project, but it turns out I had so many thoughts they threatened to overbalance things. So I'm splintering them off and addressing them separately because I think the comparison is illustrative. Also, I just really wanted to talk about this, so get ready to dive back in. Generally, people are ambivalent on fan service, at least in the sense we'll be using here. It's regarded as something tawdry, cheap, easy, and low. That's because it is. Originally, the term described cheesecake costuming and the like, and that vaguely dirty sense remains even as the definition has expanded quite a bit. It's a dangerous technique. All storytelling is in some sense manipulation, but fan service is extremely and obviously manipulative, and generally people don't react well to being manipulated. Use it carelessly, it's very likely to blow up in your face. Lots of things get called fan service now, but you usually know it when you see it, often because it makes you say, "Oh cool!" But it can also make you say, "Ugh." And if you aren't a fan and it's done poorly, it can make you say, "What?" Or, "Why are we wasting time on this?" And it was pretty easy to spot in Episode 9. They weren't exactly subtle about it. If you followed the conversation at all, you probably know about the ending, which is such a great example of how fan service can go wrong. You'd have to design something more arbitrary, and I'm not even sure if that's possible. Reports that Kevin Smith loved it are just the cherry on top of it all. For me, though, the most grating bit was Lando. I want to be clear, Lando's a great character and a culturally important one, frankly. The fact that he showed up wasn't grating. The fact that his reveal had the same tone as a Scooby-Doo guest star sure was, though. Seriously, I swear one of the characters exclaims, "Lando Calrissian, what are you doing here?" like he's Tim Conway or Sandy Duncan. Then they stare at him in reverential awe. It's yet another bizarre moment where everyone acts like they've seen the movies. Thing is, though, Final Fantasy XIV isn't exactly subtle about it either. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's got a higher density of fan service than Episode 9. Probably way higher, all told, even if you do some kind of weighting things to account for duration. But somehow, never feels grating to me. Or it seems to most people. Obviously there are people who object to some of it, but that's normal and nothing close to what Episode 9 brought on itself. And there are probably a few reasons why. For one thing, in the main questline, there are only references and winks. Doma Castle is a location in 6 and also in 14, but they have nothing in common but the name. When the Revolution makes plans to cause a mass revolt in the Imperial provinces, one of those provinces is Dalmasca, the main location in 12. And when those mass revolts start going bad, it's mentioned they went real bad in Dalmasca. Maybe put a pin in that. Even Hith's sad story about his world's end arguably has elements of fan service. When he talks about how the wind had ceased to blow, that's a callback to the very first Final Fantasy. The really showy stuff is present, but it's mostly on the side in the raids. That's where, for example, you get to fight the main antagonists of 5, 6 in the first game. And admittedly, that's something Episode 9 couldn't do. A film can't do a side story in the same way a game can. So it's more than a little unfair to directly compare the two. Therefore, I won't. But I think it's illustrative to examine the internal functioning because people love this stuff. In nearly all cases, fan service in 14 is working as intended. People get really excited to fight X-Death or Gilgamesh or Kefka or various others we'll get to in a minute. What's especially remarkable is the not-so-dirty secret that much of this stuff is cross-promotional marketing. You'd think that would be even more off-putting, but again, it hasn't been. Right now, the game is rolling out a series tied to the game Gear Automat. I'm not sure how it's actually said, but it's very popular. I'd even call it Embraced, even though Nier is a Square Enix game, but not a Final Fantasy game. Which means, come on, Essie, you know what series needs some themed raids next. Anyway, let's talk about what might be the greatest servicing of fans of all time. Not to oversell it. Let's talk about the return to Ivalice story. Ivalice is the rare recurring setting in the series, appearing in Final Fantasy XII, which was being re-released right around the time the Return to Ivalice story rolled out. It first appeared in 1997's Final Fantasy Tactics, which is fantastic. Evoking the War of the Roses at its setup, it's a story of secret histories and people living at the margins of great events. And very rare for games, especially in 1997, it features a framing device. The story is of Ramza Beolve, youngest son of a noble family who, in the midst of a massive civil war, uncovers and then defeats a massive conspiracy. But we learn, in the game's opening seconds, he won't be remembered for this. He'll be a minor footnote in history, mainly remembered as a heretic. We're told this by Arzalam, a historian and archaeologist who is sharing with you, he addresses you pretty directly as you, his findings in the Durai Papers, an account of the game's events written by one of its characters, Oran Durai. There's even a cute reveal at the end that Arzalam's name is Durai, suggesting that he's a descendant. It's an odd device, but it makes for a very moody, mournful experience, and I'm a huge fan, so I was very excited for the Return to Ivalice raids in 14. I'm a fan, after all. Early on, you meet Ramza and Alma Ba Lexentale, or Lexentali, it could be either. Alma is Ramza's sister in Tactics, and here in 14, this Ramza and this Alma are also brother and sister. But the similarities pretty much end there. While Tactics Ramza is naive but kind and decent, 14 Ramza is a punchable prick. We were in cute name drop territory. This Ramza and this Alma want you to find their father, an exiled imperial playwright with a penchant for amateur archaeology and a fascination with stories of Ivalice. He was last seen headed for the royal city of Rabanastre, the capital of Dalmasca. Astute viewers may recall that name. That's actually really important. It gives this story relevance to the one we've been experiencing through the rest of the game. It's not crucial, or even significant, but it's still a part. Anyway, you go, you fight, you find Genomus, you deal with some things, and then you have a chat where he reveals his fascination isn't amateur. Genomus Sen Lexentale is a pen name, and his real name is Arzalam Durai. Let me recreate my reaction.
Wait, what? Wait, for real? For real? Are you fucking kidding me?
Luckily, I can be more articulate now. This fan service places us firmly within the framing device of Tactics. They even drop the Tactics OST track Player Creation, which plays once during the bit where Arzalam invites you to join him in discovering the truth. It's not just hitting my pleasure sensors at recognizing a thing, it's inviting me to rejoin this story while also adding some new dimension to it. It elevates everything that happens subsequently because it has an internal reason and builds an emotional connection with me beyond the fact that I recognize it. I've been made instrumental in revealing a story I already love. So Ramza and Alma are just a cute name drop. For Arzalam too, he says he named them after his ancestors, which is a huge second revelation since the Beolves had no familial connection to Orin, and they want you to help reveal the truth of their family. I feel like I could parse out theoretical underpinnings on this forever, but I'll just focus on how meaningful this feels. Tactics is an incredibly melancholy experience, full of war and desperation and poverty and lost innocence, betrayal, inequality, and injustice. It's packed with wonderful characters, but we know, because the game tells us in the first few seconds, that none of them are likely to get a happy ending. For hundreds of years, when they're remembered at all, it will be as villains. We're even told that Oran will be executed for writing the Durai Papers. Every character in our little squad appears to die in the final battle, with the barest suggestion that Ramza may have survived. And for more than 2 decades, that's what the story was. Something sad with a vague promise that one day, these characters will get some measure of justice. Then this fan service came along and said, hey, want to get these characters some measure of justice? Amazing. Brilliant, maybe? Brilliant, probably? I don't know. I have to admit, I'm a longtime fan. It's hard for me to be distant about this, but it really hit me. So here's another little thing before we get to the story's big ending moment. In the last dungeon, 3 Tactics characters appear as bosses, challenging you to prove your worthiness, and one of them is Agrias Oaks. Agrias is, as the kids say these days, bae. She is much beloved. In the story, she's a holy knight, a bodyguard to the royal family, specifically the Princess Ovelia, who is sadly at the center of various plots and schemes. And Agrias is written exactly like you'd expect from that description, knight bodyguard to a princess. She's fierce and honorable and very protective. She gets to call people uncouth knaves. She's wonderful. And if you first encountered her as a teenager in the late 90s, it was pretty likely you saw this female character with this intense devotion to another female character, speaking about that female character in terms that, should it come from a male character, you've been conditioned to think there was more than fealty involved. You thought, I think Agrias is supposed to be gay. There was nothing supporting this, obviously. In fact, one of the big issues I think these games have is they tend to be absurdly coy. This was just a factor of how Agrias was written and translated and then viewed at the time, but still, I really loved it when at the end of her Ivalice raid fight, she says,
"Well fought, champion. I leave you now to your quest. My Ovelia awaits."
Now I want to be very clear here. This is not to trumpet that thanks to this piddling bit of dialogue, Agrias has been made the first canon LGBTQFF character. Huzzah, what a great day for representation. No, I'd actually be quite mortified if that were taken that way, but as a drop for a longtime fan, a bit of a nudge saying, hey, you know, you thought maybe Agrias really loved Ovelia? You were right. That's pretty delightful. It's pretty delightful seeing all these characters again, especially when it becomes clear why they're here. See, they never returned from their final battle. They didn't move on either. Instead, their spirits remained to safeguard the monstrous entity they were fighting, to ensure anyone who could get past them would be able to defeat it for good. After their heroic deaths, they kept fighting. That feels much more like these characters than, he did a bunch of cool guy stuff with Luke and had awesome adventures even though he was kind of a con artist and politician and never actually held a blaster. But maybe he had like a daughter who somehow got kidnapped and was made into a stormtrooper. You know, the guys our heroes have been gleefully gunning down. I'm getting off track. Point is, this appearance feels right. In the end, you get a whole line of cameos. What did you expect? You had to know this was coming. It's wonderfully cheesy, but I found myself genuinely moved. A point I could have hit harder in the initial project regarded why Episode 9's cavalry moment was so dull and indifferent, while in Shadowbringers it kicks a lot of ass. It has nothing to do with staging, or the mechanics of events, or anything happening in that moment, and everything to do with the hours and hours beforehand where Valen is despairing and facing imminent death. You need lows to have highs. Tactics had a beautiful low for more than 2 decades, and that made this high very, very satisfying. And they delivered it without compromising or damaging the original. It's incredibly impressive and shows to me just how not cheap and not tawdry fan service can be. Of course, Tactics presented a very rare opportunity, maybe even a singular one. Expecting every, or maybe even any other bit of fan service to be relevant and resonant isn't very reasonable. Even if now I think about it, the Tatooine ending totally tried for that. Still, it's a very tough hurdle to overcome. So maybe the real lesson to take from the Episode 9 autopsy comes not from the greatest fan service 14 has to offer, but the most effective. There's a school of thought that defines fan service as anything done primarily to appeal to the viewer without progressing the story or theme. And by this definition, every time you hit a button in Final Fantasy XIV, you're activating fan service. The animations on all your actions are designed to look as awesome as possible, and this service really sings when tied into the music. Remember that Nier raid? I don't know much of anything about Nier except that sad goth robots are involved, but I don't need to know anything to get really hyped by this end boss theme. So Return to Ivalice might be the greatest fan service of all time, but this could be the most perfect. This is a version of some music from Nier. I had no clue about that. I had never heard it before. The first time I did hear it coming into this fight, I was incredibly excited to get in there, and even though I was really bad at it, it was still very, very memorable. So this wasn't a case where if you're a fan, you'll recognize it, and if you're not a fan, it won't matter. This is a case where if you're a fan, you'll get a jolt, and if you're not a fan, you'll get a different but no less significant kind of jolt. I can attest that if you hit your Soul Eater or your continuation combo during the bridge, you'll feel like a fucking god.